What the scariest true story you know? I would have hated to be at the Battle of Verdun. Here's a collection of survivors' stories that give you an idea of how horrible it was. Just a few. I have returned from the most terrible ordeal I have ever witnessed. 4 days and 4 nights, 96 hours, the last 2 days in ice-cold mud, kept under relentless fire, without any protection whatsoever except for the narrow trench, which even seemed to be too wide. I arrived with 175 men. I returned with 34 of whom several had half-turned insane. One soldier was going insane with thirst and drank from a pond covered with a greenish layer near Le Morthom, Dead Man's Hill. A corpse was afloat in it, his black countenance face down in the water and his abdomen swollen as if he had been filling himself up with water for days now. We all carried the smell of dead bodies with us, the bread we ate, the stagnant water we drank. Everything we touched smelled of decomposition due to the fact that the earth surrounding us was packed with dead bodies. Everyone who searches for cover in a shell hole stumbles across slippery, decomposing bodies and has to proceed with smelly hands and smelly clothes. The Ariel Castro kidnappings. Basically, a man living in Cleveland, Ohio, kidnapped 3 young girls and kept them prisoner in his home in Tremont for 12 years. He even had a child with one. Eventually, one escaped and managed to contact police, who arrested Castro and saved the other 2 girls. Edit, changed 2 to 12, typo. This isn't the first person to do this. Unfortunately, Gary Michael Hardnick also did this. He wanted to create his own family BC. He couldn't get a woman to stay with him, so he kidnapped and locked 3 in his basement. Very creepy. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or 2 later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. The USS West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside the ship. Turns out that these noises were people. They were trapped in a room to where they couldn't be broken out of it because of the water that would seep in and drown them, and they couldn't be brought out from the top because of the gases that lingered there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of these 3 men were found. The other things that remained were empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. This means they were trapped in there for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved, and they had the fear of drowning in the tight little compartment of the ship. They had to face the realization that you are going to die and the psychological torture that goes along with it. I remember my mom telling me about a family she once knew who all died of carbon monoxide poisoning. They lived in the end unit in a row of attached townhomes and their next-door neighbor decided to commit suicide by running their car in their garage. The neighbor didn't know that the air ducts for all the townhomes were connected, so once he started the car and soon lost consciousness, the fumes traveled through the ducts into the home of the family next door and killed the mother and 2 children while they slept. I don't remember if the father died as well or if he was at work when it happened, but I know the people who lived on the other side of the units were out of town and spared. As a result, they changed the way townhomes were built so that they didn't have common airflow with connected ducts like that development did. This actually happened a few miles outside of the town I grew up in. I remember growing up hearing the story then and again from adults or at school. She was actually saved by a waitress as Denny's who recognized her and called the cops. My stepmom also worked for the police dispatch in our county around that time, and she was there when they got the call from Denny's that she had been found. Always so creepy to realize this can happen in your own backyard. In the 80s there was a Mexican cult led by an American named Adolfo Constanzo. They used to kidnap random people from tourist towns and nearby cities and perform human sacrifice on them in their rural Mexican desert compound, usually torturing in elaborate rituals for hours or days before finally letting them die. These rituals included vivisections, castrations, eyeball removal, tongue removal, teeth pulling, skin flaying, hanging, etc. They used amphetamines and cocaine to force the victim to stay awake during the torture and not pass out from shock. The cult believed the more pain and fear they could generate in the sacrificed victim, the more powerful the body parts would be as ritual trinkets and also for food for the cult's nganga, which is a large ritual cauldron used to store bones, blood, meat, and other valuable items that the cult believed gave them power. They used to make staves out of wire to gather spinal columns, and they would often eat the victim's eyeballs during the rituals. They are believed to have kidnapped and sacrificed over 26 people to their nganga in their 3 years that they were active from 1986 to 1989. The leader committed suicide when the police showed up at their compound. They arrested 14 cult members, but most people believe there were at least a dozen more that escaped and are still out there. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend and she had the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying, facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in this foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely mid-2000s. He actually fucking planned the whole thing 6 years in advance, got a building permit and built a inescapable apartment-like prison underneath his house. He drove miles to dispose of trash and do shopping for the imprisoned and not be recognized while doing so. Seriously fucked up. He was only found out because one of the children he fathered got seriously ill and had to be taken to the hospital after spending her whole 19-year-long life underground. He claimed that his daughter, Elizabeth, thought to have been abducted by a cult, dropped the granddaughter off at his house because she wasn't able to take care of the sick young woman. Doctors found the story fishy, involved authorities and demanded to speak to Elizabeth in order to find out what her daughter was suffering from. I'm on my phone, so please forgive my formatting. I read the book a few years ago. I believe 3 of the children were too fussy, and the noise would raise alarm, so individually he brought them upstairs for his wife to care for. He told the wife the daughter was in a cult and dropped the babies off in the night, and the wife never questioned it. The babies were raised to not know better. After the rescue, the upstairs kids and basement kids finally met and went to therapy together. I can't imagine either side ever fully recovering from the ordeal. After seeing this here, I decided to read about this case. What he did was heinously monstrous. However, these 2 things stick out. From Wikipedia, over the next 2 hours, she told the story of her 24 years in captivity. Elizabeth told the police that Fritzl raped her and forced her to watch pornographic videos, which he made her reenact with him in front of her children in order to humiliate her. In his opening remarks, Rudolf Meyer, the defending counsel, appealed to the jury to be objective and not be swayed by emotions. He insisted Fritzl was not a monster, stating that Fritzl had brought a Christmas tree down to his captives in the cellar during the holiday season. Elizabeth was reported to be distraught and close to a breakdown after a British paparazzo had burst into her kitchen and started taking photographs. This was during her rehabilitation. In 1949, Timothy Evans was wrongly executed for murdering his pregnant wife and daughter. The actual murderer, John Christie, was a prosecution witness at Evans' trial. After Evans was executed, Christie went on to kill 4 more people. Had the police handled the forensic evidence properly, Christie would have been caught when they were investigating Evans, and those 4 people would still be alive. The government didn't acknowledge that Evans was innocent until 2004. It wasn't about forensics. The police coerced a confession out of Evans. We went over this in my linguistics class. A forensic linguist was able to determine that his verbatim confession had actually been written by 2 different people. That's why he was posthumously exonerated. H.G., the lone survivor of what would later be called the Wichita Massacre. She was a 25-year-old elementary school teacher at the time, and had gone to the triplex where her boyfriend, Jason Beffert, a science teacher, lived with 2 roommates, Brad Haka, a chemist, and Aaron Sander, who was studying to become a priest. H.G. settled in front of the TV and began grading papers when Heather Muller, a friend of Aaron Sanders, showed up. The 5 friends watched TV and eventually retired to their various bedrooms. H.G. was woken from her sleep shortly after by loud voices and the bedroom door being kicked open. The 2 perps eventually gathered all of the persons in the residence and herded them to the bedroom and ordered them, at gunpoint, to strip. Many atrocities occurred as hours went by, but in the end H.G., after being shot in the head in a frozen soccer field, ran naked for almost a mile to find a house with Christmas lights, it was mid-December, to beg for assistance. https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/Wichita_massacre. Alison Botha. On December 18, 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Alison Botha was abducted, raped, stabbed and left for dead by Franz Dutoit and Thunz Kruger. They slashed her throat 17 times, so deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand she had to hold in the organ spilling from her stomach, where she had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle the knife thrusts had missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There is a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called Alison, worth the watch but might be traumatic for some viewers. Trailer for Alison. There was a creepy story that happened in Japan not that long ago. The cops found a 5-year-old and 3-year-old just wandering the streets. He asked them where they came from and they were 3 kilometers far from their house. When the cops took them home, the mother looked worried and was really apologetic about the situation. Mother was holding a baby. Cop decides to do some research on the family just in case. Files said that the baby daughter the mother was holding should have been much bigger than what he saw. Thought maybe it was a case of neglect. The 2 older kids walking alone was also red flag, so they got officials to visit the house. Asks if they could have a look at the baby daughter. Turns out to be a boy, a whole year younger than the files. Ended up finding the 3rd child buried in their backyard. Something must have happened to the baby. They quickly decided to have another kid to cover it and was planning on raising it as the dead daughter. I can't write sentences/am Japanese. I don't know if it's scary, but when I was younger me and my twin brother would help our friend do his paper route. One summer we could smell something gross coming from one of the houses. We all didn't think anything of it until 3 days later when the smell was reaching down the driveway. We went to the back door where he normally dropped the paper and noticed it was open. We went in and looked around the house and found the owner dead. He had died of a heart attack and his cats were eating him. Yes, it does. My grandfather's brother was an old man that lived alone. One afternoon his neighbors started calling my family because there was a strange smell coming from the house. We all imagined what had happened. As I was in my 20s and apparently the only one that could get inside the house after jumping his backyard fence, we didn't have the keys from his house. I was assigned the task of going inside. As soon as I reached his bedroom I noticed his corpse lying near the bed. The smell was awful. I remember turning my sight to see the bedroom and as I was rolling my head I kept my head going until I faced the way out again. That was enough. Took the meds. Too many attempts to remove his body and take it to the morgue. My father told me they were puking a lot. Apparently the body had been laying there for quite a few days and it was starting to decompose. I read a story recently about Paulette Gerber Farah, a 4-year-old child who went missing from her room in 2010. Her parents immediately notified authorities, and started a social media campaign to find Paulette. Paulette's room was searched multiple times and used by her parents to do media interviews. Here's the terrifying part. Paulette was found dead 10 days later, in her bed. She had wedged herself between the mattress and the footboard and suffocated. Here is her bed before they found her. It's insane looking at that picture and knowing she is there and no one had found her. Here is an article for anyone interested. https://www.sandiguniontribune.com/news/nationworld/Mexico stunned missing child found dead at home 2010 Apro4story.html. Edit fixed link. A lesser-known fact. Even though many people died in this situation, it led scientists to discover another lake with almost the exact same situation occurring. The difference was that the other lake was near a relatively large city. A CO2 bubble forming at the bottom of the lake would have almost certainly been burst by an earthquake. Thankfully, since scientists were able to find it quick enough, they created a system that could slowly vent that CO2 and prevent many more people from dying. I believe they just put the straw into the bottom and let it burp the gases slowly in a controlled manner, thus avoiding any massive release that would kill everyone. I remember reading that it's due to massive organic material deposits that decompose, but I could be mistaken about that. Lots of old legends around the lake of spirits rising up and killing everyone. I could not speak. I became unconscious. I could not open my mouth because then I smelled something terrible. I heard my daughter snoring in a terrible way, very abnormal. When crossing to my daughter's bed, I collapsed and fell. I was there till 9 o'clock in the morning of Friday, the next day. Until a friend of mine came and knocked at my door. I was surprised to see that my trousers were red, had some stains like honey. I saw some starchy mess on my body. My arms had some wounds. I didn't really know how I got these wounds. I opened the door. I wanted to speak, my breath would not come out. My daughter was already dead. I went into my daughter's bed, thinking that she was still sleeping. I slept till it was 4:30 in the afternoon. On Friday, the same day. Then, I managed to go over to my neighbors' houses. They were all dead. I decided to leave, because most of my family was in Guam. I got my motorcycle. A friend whose father had died left with me, for Guam. As I rode through Neos, I didn't see any sign of any living thing. When I got to Guam, I was unable to walk, even to talk. My body was completely weak. The Reina Mara Queen story. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s, got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss's wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally, one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. This isn't a scary story, but it's spooky and always captured my imagination. One day a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out. All the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there. Edited to correct some mistakes.